For today's video, we're going to be discussing getting the basic movement or motion of your character right in both a 2D and 3D space. Those are the topics suggested on our Discord channel. And something like this from the outside, it sounds very simple. Just make your gameplay like Mario or Super Meat Boy. But this is a combination of UI and UX design, and it's often either the start of something amazing or the nail in the coffin for somebody to play your game. As we said at the start, we're going to be covering both 2D and 3D design because there are some major differences between the two, especially when you're trying to manipulate a camera and kind of getting the motion right in that space. Nevertheless, when we're talking about basic movement and motion in a game, these are often areas where a lot of developers tend to struggle with. And as somebody who wrote a book on platformers, I have seen a huge variety of games in terms of how a character behaves in it. And there are a lot of very subtle aspects behind character movement and motion that if you don't get right, it can easily just completely ruin your game or ruin the experience for the player. Now, what makes things very interesting to talk about is that with every video game, there's always subtle differences. Again, we can talk about like a basic gamepad or a basic button layout, such as A to jump, X to attack, control stick to move around, but how those things actually work in game is certainly up for debate. And like I said, you can't just say, make your game behave like Mario or Super Meat Boy, and it'll make things perfect. Every title, depending upon design, will need to be examined in terms of what the player is being asked to do. And that's very important. If we're talking about a game that is more focused on kind of puzzle platforming, the Swapper, Wonderkin, and many other 2D style games like that, precise, Super Meat Boy fidelity levels of movement are often not required, and in many cases that would be a detriment to those experiences. Because when you're building a game that's about puzzle solving or obstacle manipulation or getting around them, you don't want the player to need Superboy levels of skill or technical prowess in order to beat them. Likewise, if we're trying to make a game that requires a lot of very complicated motions, we're going to be ducking and weaving around projectiles and, spikes and triple jumping and all that, then those controls had better be on point to facilitate that. You don't want the player to kind of have to force to adapt to it in order to make the game feel right. Because we have played games like that, where you're asking the player to do a lot of very complicated or very challenging jumps, and the character does not behave right. One of the more famous examples is the idea of an animation delay. So if you use my lovely little hand here as a character, that normally when you press the button, the character jumps immediately. It's 1-to-1. Other games, those who are more on the slower side or those who aren't designed as well, will go like this. I hit the button, the character takes a second and jumps. There's, like that kind of wind-up animation. And this is a killer for any high-level technical focused platforming. Because you don't want the player to have to force to extrapolate, I need to do all these sets of actions, but I also need to delay all my button press by half a second, or do it a half a second ahead so that my character will properly behave in time. And like I said, there's a lot of these little subtleties to movement and motion that you need to think about as a developer. Now, over there in the corner there is Ori and the Will-o-the-Wisps, and both Ori games are probably some of the best 2D platforming and probably two of the best Metroidvanias I have played in the last 10 or so years. And part of that is not only just the variety of maneuvers that Ori gets, but how the game feels in your hands. And anyone who has played Ori certainly knows what I'm talking about. Like we said a second ago, this is a game that is one-to-one in terms of button press to character response. There are no animation delays. Everything feels very snappy. The second I hit the button, it does what I want it to do. And one of the things that can lead to cumbersome or very clumsy control schemes is when it feels like you are fighting the game. I'm sure everybody watching this right now has an example or two of a game where it doesn't feel right. That you tell the character to do this, and they do something completely different, or it doesn't work as you said. When we talk about 3D based games, for instance, a very big example of this is that many 3D titles make use of macro and micro actions. A micro action would be, walk very slowly, sneak, leap over an edge. A macro action would be, duck and tumble, do a massive jump to clear 50 feet. And oftentimes, and this is something that we also see from some 2D games, that in order to try and streamline the control scheme, they will put multiple commands on individual buttons, or they'll tie commands to various combinations, such as X is not the same as forward X, which is not the same as back left X, which is not the same as double tap back X. And what ends up happening is that when the player is trying to perform a specific command, most likely they're going to hit the wrong one. And there's definitely a whole nother topic about designing a comfortable control scheme. That's another maybe 20-30 minutes on top of this video that we don't have time to get to today. And when you're in a 2D space in particular, these games are always about being action or player skill focus. And because of that, you want the control scheme to be as responsive as possible. Like I said a few minutes ago, depending upon the design in question, you can get away with, again, not needing that high level fidelity that we see from Super Meat Boy or Ori. But it all comes back to what it is your game is centered on. And most importantly, again, you want to avoid anything that distracts or kind of, again, takes the player's focus away from what they're doing on screen. Part of that, again, is designing the control scheme to be comfortable. Another is making sure that all the actions feel right in the player's hands. Speaking of which, and with that footage in the corner there, this is probably the perfect time to talk about. If you want your game to feel really great, look into this idea of evolving the movement tech, or the technical play of your game. With Ori, one of the things that the game does really well is that it integrates all the moves and mechanics that Ori gets, not only into the level design itself, but into what the player can do as well. What we mean by that, in a lot of games that give the player specific powers, specific upgrades, they will kind of lock them into each other. What I mean by that is that you can't do, let's say, mechanic B while you're doing mechanic A. This could be due to animations, could be just due to how the button layouts or how the abilities work. You can't essentially kind of combo your tech or your movement abilities. Ori, on the other hand, not only makes you do that or allows you, it rewards you in many crazy ways, such as being able to break sequences and kind of get around. Like when you get to the later parts of Ori, sorry, my hair keeps getting in my eyes, the pandemic hair. As you get into later parts of Ori, it requires that of you. So a section in Ori could be double jump into a wall run up, jump off the wall, do another double jump, do a burst off a projectile launching you in the air, to then glide, to do another jump, to hit a wall, jump off of that, dash forward, do a super jump, and then land on a platform. Now, what I just described there probably took me a good 5 to 6 seconds. In game, that probably occurred within maybe a second to 2 seconds of what the player is actually doing in game. And all those commands can be used to interrupt one another. They flow very well. And I know some of you will probably be thinking about the Dark Souls series in terms of how that can feel a little clumsy in your hands, and we'll talk about that when we get to 3D design in the next minute or so. But again, when you're designing your game, you want to look at not only what abilities the player or what you're designing, but how can the player make use of them? And if you can combine abilities or allow the player to effortlessly flow from one to the other, it's going to make your game feel a lot better. Again, imagine a supercar with the most expensive parts, the most, beautiful paint job. I don't know paint, so I don't know how you would describe that. And put all that together, and then give it a steering wheel that is not working right. And you can see how all these elements, if they're not in sync, are going to ruin your game. And this will definitely be felt by the player. And when the player feels like the game is not working for them, it will ultimately lead to them just not caring about your game anymore. And like I said, it's very tough to kind of get that feel right, especially when you first go around. This is one of those aspects that is going to take iterating and play testing to perfect. But with that said, we're going to take a quick break, and when we return, we're going to talk about how 3D games do it, and that weird contradiction, as we said, when it comes to Souls-like kind of design. And now for a quick shout out to our current Game Wisdom supporters and sponsors. Going forward, all Patreon supporters will get early access to our videos. And if you'd like to continue this discussion on game design, be sure to check out our Discord channel, linked down below. If you're looking for more wisdom about game design, be sure to check out my latest offering of books, 20 Essential Games to Study, aimed for first-time developers and students looking for some inspiration for their upcoming games, and Game Design Deep Dive Platformers if you're interested in anything regarding 2D and 3D platforming design. They're both available in print, digital, and wherever books are being sold. As we move into 3D based games, you knew we were going to include a Mario game as our example, because Nintendo has always done a really amazing job with the general movement and feel of Mario in each one of the 3D based titles. Part of that has always been Nintendo's willingness to kind of give Mario a variety of mechanics or tech that go around with controlling him. And this is something that we, as a very strange situation, we don't see a lot of other 3D studios do that with their franchises. Maybe the closest would be something like Assassin's Creed or Marvel's Spider-Man. But even in those cases, the movement tech is usually very restrictive. It has to be done at specific points or under specific circumstances. With Mario and with Nintendo's design, you have a variety of moves that can be used not only in multiple situations, but can often be used to be chained into each other. As you just saw me attempt to do that right there with the triple into a cappy into a dive jump. And again, I am not the best Mario Odyssey player by any stretch of the imagination, but if you really want to see proof of the variety of tech that can go into a Mario game, watch anyone who speedruns any of the 3D Mario games. You can just see, again, all the things that you can really do with Mario. Now, right there, I failed, but I could have made that jump if I did a cappy bounce, which I think I'm going to do that in the next minute, if I remember this footage here. But again, the purpose of Mario's tech is that not only can it be used in a variety of circumstances, but they can be used to be chained off of each other. Typically, how it works is that each move or each element has an internal or inherent limit to it. For instance, Mario can't jump a second time in the air, but he can bounce off of Cappy. He can do that Cappy bounce at any time. And depending upon when you do it will obviously affect your trajectory as Mario. And when you start combining tech like this, it opens up the door to a lot more things you can do in terms of level design. And even with Mario here, Nintendo never really goes all in terms of the movement tech. Apparently, I didn't make that jump there, but I could have. Let me just put it like that. But even the hardest challenges in a Mario game never truly make use of all the tech, especially not in the same way that we see developers like we see speedrunners make use of. And what you're seeing right here, as I'm having trouble, like I'm getting stuck on the wall, I'm doing the wall jump. That again is one of the challenges you have to worry about when you have a lot of different tech associated to similar commands. And we see this especially in a lot of open world games when you're trying to do something very minute, maybe just do a small walk or a small leap, and your character again jumps or dives or does some crazy action that takes you completely away from what you're trying to do. And this is again often a problem with 3D based games, or especially with the open world genre. Open world games are often about making very grand, very large movements and actions because there's so much space to get around. So when you're trying to do something that is very small, very like almost a micro adjustment, these games aren't often set up for that. And this is again why you don't see the same level of technical based challenges in a 3D game as you would in a 2D. In a 2D. Imagine for a second if somebody tried to make Super Meat Boy but in a 3D space. It would be almost impossible to get the same level of fidelity and control of Meat Boy in 3D or even in first person that you would with the 2D design. Again, a lot of that has to do with how the character behaves and just the 2D plane itself. Now, as I said in the last part, some of you are probably thinking about the Dark Souls games, and the Souls-likes have a very weird exception to this rule in terms of fidelity and control. As anyone who's played a Souls game or watches one knows, there is animation buffering and input delay in a Souls-like. What that means is when your character is performing an animation, they cannot exit that animation. I think the only exception may be dodge maneuvers, but only before the actual attack goes off. There's a sense of deliberateness or a slower pace in a Souls-like than there are in other 3D games, especially the action genre. If you put Dark Souls next to something like Bayonetta or Devil May Cry, it looks downright sluggish by comparison. But the reason why the Souls-likes get away with it is that there is this sense of internal momentum or consistency to these characters. That nobody behaves like a Bayonetta or a Devil May Cry character in a Souls-like. Not the player, not the enemies. And everything is kind of balanced or weighted around that. When you're looking at enemies fight, or a boss fight in a Dark Souls game, they're never going to do animation canceling or frame canceling, because not only would that be kind of breaking the game, but it would be a complete blow or destruction of the rules that the game sets up for the player. This is why you have to be very careful if you're designing a Souls-like design, that everybody needs to kind of operate on the same rules. With Mario and kind of platformers or 3D based movement focus, typically it's asymmetry or it's asymmetrical bounce. Again, the enemies that you're fighting as Spider-Man don't have web crawling or web based powers, obviously. In Mario here, no other character in the game can move like Mario. And that's alright, because these games are designed to set up for completely different characters and completely different mechanics and moves. In a Souls-like, or in a very combat or more kind of slower paced focus, everybody needs to operate under the same rules of the world, or it's going to be game breaking. Imagine if in Dark Souls, you could animation cancel at any time. Imagine if your Dark Souls character behaved like Dante, but all the enemies still operate the same way. It would be completely game breaking in your favor. And while that may sound like a great idea, it will hurt a game in terms of providing a meaningful challenge. Now, with something like Mario, and getting back to movement and motion, again, as you've been watching this footage, I hope you've been noting all the different movement-based abilities that Mario has access to. And another thing to keep in mind, there are no unlocks in Mario. Mario starts with every ability that he's going to get, and he will never unlock anything new. And this is a very important point, and one of the reasons why Mario Odyssey would obviously not be considered a Metroidvania. That this game is balanced around all of Mario's abilities, but the game specifically does not test or challenge all of them at once. And this kind of subjective level design is something that I've talked about before, that depending upon your skill level in Mario, you will have a completely different experience. A novice player is going to be using Mario differently than an expert or a speedrunner, but both groups can make progress. It's just going to be different or a different amount of time. With Mario here, and with my skill with playing with Mario, I was able to do a lot more, a lot sooner, compared to somebody who hasn't played a 3D Mario game before. And again, these levels are set up to accompany or to be a companion to all of Mario's movement tech right out of the box. As you saw, there are sections set up that allow me to sequence break or get around them if I was knowledgeable enough at the game. But there are still the basic ways to get through if I'm not that good. And this is, again, one of the things you have to keep in mind if you're designing a game, whether it's in a 2D or 3D space. That whatever abilities you give the player, the level design must be set up to make use of it or reward the player. Again, there's a difference between having a super hard challenge that allows the player to skip a section or get a bonus reward versus making that tech be required. That you must be able to do all that or you will not be able to make any progress. With that said, to wrap things up for this video, again, movement and feel are such cornerstones of good UI and good UX design. And when you don't do it right, it just can completely kill a game and kill somebody's interest in it. But when we see the high quality examples, Mario, Ori, Super Meat Boy, etc., it really elevates everything else when you get that feel right. So here's my final question for you. I've already mentioned, we already know good 2D examples, we mentioned a few 3D ones here. I want to know, can you think of examples of either 3D or first-person based games that did exemplary work with their movement tech and the overall feel of motion for their characters? Let me know in the comments below, and thanks again for watching. Come back for daily discussions on game design here, and on game wisdom, where is in the art and science of games. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed things, be sure to do all the liking and subscribing that the kids are doing these days. Check out our Discord channel link down below where we hang out and chat game design, and come back later tonight for our regular streamings. But that's it, and tune in for more great content here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games.